Welcome to the Alcove. I'm Mark Malero. My guest today is David Harrison. He is assistant professor of linguistics at Swarthmore College near Philadelphia. He's also the author of the new book, When Languages Die. He was recently featured in the documentary, The Linguists. Here's a look at that program.
On a first visit to a community, we want to take a kind of census and figure out how many speakers are there and what do they know.
Еще носители чулымского языка здесь.
Our first real speaker turned out to be very hard of hearing.
Как? Носители, те, которые еще говорят.
It's hard with a dying or endangered language because most of the speakers are elderly.
Что-нибудь интересное подскажете нам на чулымском?
Перешелдарна. Шумелахта. Чуртама Шангылда.
He's lived here since 1961.
Новый Тарлагана.
That was our first sentence.
Ну я оттуда там работа уже.
Our second speaker alternated between shouting at us and saying that she loved us. I wouldn't call it a conversation.
Yeah.
We got
It was a monologue that we had to listen to.
He says, you must be a Kazakh.
And I'm Tatar.
You must be.
In order to study a language, you need speakers who can sit and focus.
22 года. 22 года.
24-го.
Östülden kopsata şpiyimskam.
After meeting our first two real speakers, we were a little discouraged. The third speaker that we were taken to meet, she was in her 90s.
Вы можете кое-что сказать на чулымском?
She was almost completely deaf.
Нам сказать на чулымском?
Скажи что-нибудь на чулымском языке. На чулымском языке скажи.
Она на своем скажет.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, in your new book, it's interesting because you say that there's almost 7,000 languages worldwide, and you're saying that by the end of the century, at least half of those will likely be gone, and most are only oral languages. They've never been written down. I was wondering if you could kind of just give us an idea of the kind of crisis state that languages face right now.
Well, it is a crisis, and this is something that I think will really grip people. People don't commonly know that there are 7,000 languages, and they're pleased and surprised when they hear that, because I think people like languages. Even people who don't know any other language than their own, they tend to like languages. The idea of lots of languages, different ways to say things. But by current estimates, about half of those languages could go extinct in this century, and that's a rate of a language roughly every 2 weeks. And my research looks at the global crisis, trying to find patterns globally. Where are languages going extinct fastest? What are the causes driving them into extinction? What are some of the causes allowing languages to persist and to survive? And then the big question, which is, why should we care? Are we losing something that's irreplaceable, or is this just silliness and something that we could just as easily express in English?
Right, and you're obviously making the argument that we're losing something very valuable, clearly.
We don't even know what it is we're losing, but what we do know about is of incredible value, both to the speaker communities themselves and potentially to humankind and our survival on the planet.
Yeah. And what is your notion of this idea of almost sort of an Englishification, if you will, of what's happening in the world when you look at digital media and you look at, the language of business? You make the case that something like 80% of languages that are spoken are major languages, and some of these more indigenous languages are very small. But obviously, like you're saying, we don't even really know what we're losing.
About 80% of the world's population speaks the major languages. That's a list of about 84 languages.
Right.
And it's true that they almost completely dominate in global media.
Mm-hmm.
But there are another 6,000 something languages, and all of those languages, each one of them is incredibly rich in what they have to say, in their history, their mythology, their science. And as you mentioned, most of them have never been written down, and so they're not recorded anywhere. You can't find them in any library or database. The information is just in people's memories, so in one sense it's very fragile.
Mm. And it's interesting because you're saying that that's a large part of your job as a scientist, as a linguist, is to be the one that does document that. Do you feel it must be a tremendous responsibility to do that? You talk about a lot of last speakers that you even get to know personally in the book, and it's a very interesting responsibility because, again, you're documenting these people. A lot of them will be the last speakers of a particular indigenous language.
Yeah, it's really amazing and humbling to have the opportunity to meet with last speakers of languages. And I've traveled to many places in the world, Siberia, India, the Philippines, and when I meet these last speakers, they've been very, very generous in sharing some of their wisdom and their knowledge with me. And so I do feel a heavy responsibility because many times the recordings that I make of these speakers are among the only recordings available. In some cases they are the first recordings ever made of a language in a digital format, and in some cases they are also what will be, in fact, the last recordings ever made of fluent speakers. And so there's a very narrow window of opportunity here. I don't own the data that I collect. I'm a curator of it.
Okay.
It's owned by the speakers themselves, although sometimes the community itself doesn't necessarily value those materials at the present time,
I see.
but they may come to value them in the future. And so the question is, how can I responsibly archive these materials so that they're available to anybody in the future?
Right. Now, is that a common practice amongst linguists to give the ownership of those materials to the native speakers, or is that something that's maybe more of your personal style of science?
Well, we don't give ownership. I mean, they
Okay.
do own the language,
Right.
and this is particularly true of small languages. There's a heightened sense of ownership and of intellectual property in a way that French speakers don't quite own the French language,
Right.
because it's big. But when you're talking about a speech community where there's only 30 people, there is a much stronger sense in which they own the language. And not only that, but the language encodes ideas and concepts and technologies which are their intellectual property.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not a category that's recognized in international copyright law, unfortunately.
Okay.
Collective ownership of an idea is not a patentable concept, but it is a very culturally real concept. And so we have to be careful here about being very responsible in our use of the data.
Right. And how does that work academically? Do academic institutions entirely back up that kind of philosophy? Is this a way that most linguists practice their science? Is this a very common thing, for instance?
It's moving towards a model where you have collaborative work and you understand that copyright and ownership remains with the speech community.
Okay.
Again, we're still working out some of the details here in linguistics and anthropology. Given a history of exploitative data extraction models that the sciences have used, and trying to move towards something that's more enlightened, we haven't quite gotten there yet, but we're aware of the goal at least.
Okay. And it's interesting because you call this the greatest conservation challenge amongst humankind right now. You give 3 key reasons for that. I was wondering if you could talk about those reasons.
Yeah, this is the greatest conservation challenge. Imagine if half of the species on the planet were going to go extinct in this century. The percentage is much smaller than that for species. Imagine if half of the important architectural monuments were going to be demolished in this century. You know, if the pyramids and the Notre Dame Cathedral were going to be demolished for no good reason, people would be outraged.
Absolutely.
These are recognized universally as treasures that belong to all of humankind. But a language is a much older and more intricate and complex monument to human genius than anything we've ever built with our hands. And so there is a real sense of loss, and the idea that small communities face great challenges in trying to overcome oppression and prejudice and a feeling of low self-esteem, which are things that may cause them to give up their language.
Right.
And so while they're the only ones who can save the language, there's also some support required from the outside. And I think it's important that people understand, we've got to pitch in and help with these language revitalization projects because we're all going to be impoverished if these ideas are lost.
Is it easy to approach people and give them the sense in terms of trusting you, the idea of conveying the importance that what you're doing is recording something for posterity, for other people, preserving a language? Is it a difficult thing to approach, let's say, an Indigenous people that you don't know yet personally, and you come to them and you say, this is what I want to do? What is sort of a typical reaction that you would get?
You do have to build trust, and this is part of the skill set that you acquire as an anthropologist.
Right.
You could be dropped into anywhere, and you've got to be able to make friends and build alliances and get people to trust you in order to get any work done. Of course, some parts of the world are easier to work in than others. Some places people are more receptive to being filmed or recorded than others.
Okay. What would be easier, for instance? Like, what would be an easier area?
Well, Siberia, which is the area that I've spent most of my time in,
Okay.
people are extremely welcoming to outsiders. They are completely nonchalant about being filmed or videotaped. They have absolutely no problem with that. And they're eager to share their stories. I would contrast that to native North America, where even though there was a similar history of oppression or cultural genocide,
Right.
it is very difficult to break through and gain the trust of those communities.
Okay.
It takes years and years. But however long it takes, you have to do that in order to be able to work in these communities.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, too, it's interesting because you talk about the idea of what you call a folksonomy, essentially a folk taxonomy of the kind of things that are embedded in a language. And it's very interesting because, there are so many things that people normally don't consider. And as you're saying, this is very much kind of an invisible problem that people don't understand. There are various ways of speaking that are within an Indigenous language, and it reflects a lot of very particular culture. You give about a half dozen case studies. I wonder if you can maybe talk about one case study.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think we suffer from what I call a science bias. That is, we think that if there's anything worth knowing, that science knows it.
Okay.
But this is not the case. The Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson has pointed out that something like 80% of the plant and animal species in the world have not yet been discovered.
Wow.
By scientists. This doesn't mean that people don't know about them. This means that they haven't been taxonomized within our system of science.
Okay.
If you go in and talk to Indigenous people, they do know intimately the plants and animals that live in their ecological niche. And
Right.
they understand how they fit into a holistic system. What are the dependencies among them, the interactions, the various interlocking cycles. So there is an immense body of scientific knowledge out there. You could call it folk scientific knowledge as long as you don't intend to put it down by calling it folk knowledge, because in some cases it is more sophisticated than what science knows.
Right.
So I have worked for a number of years with reindeer herders in Siberia, and
Right, the TOFA.
yeah, the TOFA people, they have a very intricate classification system for reindeer. You can utter a single word in TOFA, so if I say chari, that would have to translate into English as a 2-year-old male, uncastrated, rideable reindeer.
Very
Now, I can express that concept in English, but English does not provide us with a neatly packaged concept that captures all of the parameters of reindeerhood.
Right.
So they've figured it out. Their survival has depended on this. And you can also show cases where scientific knowledge held in Indigenous communities is ahead of what science knows. So the Halcomelum musqueam people of British Columbia
Okay.
they're a river-based people, so they know a lot about fish. And there are 4 fish which they group together under a single label, But in our English folk classification, we call 2 of those fish salmon, and we call the other 2 trout.
Wow.
So you could easily say from our English point of view, well, the Musqueam people got it wrong. You know, they think that these 4 fish are the same, but we know that they're salmon and trout.
Right.
Except that when a genetic study was done in the 1990s, it was discovered that genetically the fish actually do belong to the same species.
So we're the ones
And
that are
our
impoverished.
folk taxonomy had got it wrong.
Right.
So I don't want to say that indigenous knowledge is always more sophisticated or always right.
Mhm.
But we should at least entertain the possibility that it is the product of millennia of close observation of nature. A kind of experimentation, as you will. Not the kind of experimentation that our scientists do in labs, but
Right.
a kind of live-in experiment. And so it can be more sophisticated and more precise than what science knows. We're still stuck in this colonial paradigm that goes all the way back to Captain Cook and his voyages around the world. You know, he had naturalists and botanists with him on his ships, and they
Right.
discovered species everywhere they went. But what they were really doing is, it's like they had a big broom, and they would sail into Hawaii, and they would say, "Oh, natives and native knowledge of plants and fish. You know,
Right.
sweep that away. We're going to name these animals."
As if they were somehow savages
As
or
if,
something.
well, as if they were ignorant of
Right.
the species in their ecosystem.
Yeah.
Nothing could be further from the truth. And even to this day, this discovery paradigm persists. So you regularly see articles in the news that scientists went to Suriname or they went to Irian Jaya and they discovered 6 new bird species. It's simply not credible to think that the people who have lived in those environments for millennia don't know about these species and haven't given them names and haven't fit them into a taxonomy.
Right.
So this is the knowledge gap. It is large and it is essentially in our disfavor. So there's much more that we don't know than what we do know. Much of that knowledge is held by indigenous peoples in endangered languages, and it's eroding very rapidly.
Now, it's interesting because would that be an element of your book that might have some controversy amongst the scientific community? Because if there is that bias, that seems to be one of the most novel implications of your book. What kind of a reaction have you gotten both from, let's say, linguists, but then people outside of your area of science, just fellow scientists?
Well, linguists generally don't know about biology. This is a problem of compartmentalization in the sciences. So a linguist is the key to a language, because the linguist is the person who can go into a community and can really penetrate the language and absorb it and understand it on its own terms, what we call the emic perspective. You delve into a knowledge system and you understand it on its own terms.
Right.
However, linguists aren't typically trained in botany. And then you might have a botanist or a lepidopterist or some specialist zoologist who goes in and who can understand and catalog species, but they don't know the local language and they're not trained to absorb the local language and understand it. So you need kind of hybrid science where you've got linguists talking to zoologists, talking to indigenous people, and trying to understand the knowledge systems.
Now, is that actually your approach? Because it's interesting, because you do bring kind of a hybrid approach. Do you have training in other scientists, or do you then just work closely with other specialists?
I don't, but I try to work with other specialists wherever I can. And this is a kind of a challenge to science. You know, let's stop claiming that we've discovered species so that we can name them after our mother. And let's start acknowledging the vast body of knowledge that is out there. And there are some amazing scholars in this area who are doing precisely that, who really delve into a local ecosystem and understand local knowledge of that. This is a kind of a buzzword in anthropology, local knowledge.
Right.
It's slowly seeping over into the biological sciences, but they're still very much in this discovery Western science paradigm.
Yeah, that's been around for a long time.
Right, that if Western science doesn't know it, then it is effectively unknown.
Right.
You know.
Which is really almost an imperial way of looking at it. It's a very old-fashioned way of looking at things.
It's very colonialist.
Yeah. I'm wondering as well, one thing I think a lot of people would be very curious about is, what is your approach when you go out into the field? How do you, as a native English speaker, not only document these often languages that are so different, but how do you do that technically? How are you able to find essentially a technology that makes sense to you, to those people, and then to the people that read your work. How do you approach that?
Well, Mark, I won't give away all the professional secrets of linguistics,
Okay.
but we do have
There are
techniques
secrets?
for, well, they're not secrets, but
Yeah, your trade.
they're the kind of training that you would acquire if you did an advanced degree in linguistics. But there are techniques for going in and documenting at least some portion of a language, even when you have no common language. They're not as sophisticated as when you do have a common language, so you have to start out by simply pointing to things, and there are pitfalls there.
I imagine. Yeah.
You know, a lot of times even the pointing gesture is not culturally common, so if I go into some culture and I say, "What's that?" I might get the word for finger instead of the word for tree, because they don't use a finger pointing gesture, and so this is not understood.
Wow.
But there are techniques for building up from having no common language and trying to get some words all the way up to where you use what's called a contact language. So if I were in Siberia, I could speak Russian and the native Siberians could speak Russian, and through Russian I could get at their language. But that's a very skewed view of their language. The ideal, and what I have done with several languages, is to immerse myself in the environment and learn the language. And this is very slow and painstaking, but the dividends are huge, because once I actually learn the language, then I use the language itself to elicit more information about the language.
Now, what would be a typical time period for you to immerse yourself? What would be maybe required?
Well, I lived in Tuva, which is in South Siberia, for a year. I lived with nomads, yak herders, camel herders. At the beginning, it was very difficult. I was reduced to almost zero conversational ability. I purposely went to places where no Russian was spoken. So I have done the, immerse yourself from scratch and learn a language the hard way. And, it's very rewarding. It's a lot of hard work. But, a language is such an intricate system. Any little portion that you choose to analyze, as you dive into it and analyze it, it expands. It's bottomless. You can't exhaust a language. A language is an infinite system. It produces infinite combinations of new things out of a finite set of building blocks.
Right.
And it's probably unique in the animal kingdom for being such a combinatory system. So you can't exhaust a language.
Okay. I guess maybe my last question would be, are you optimistic about the future? Because again, your book spells out how this is such an important thing that is often invisible to most people. In a sense, you're educating both perhaps fellow academics, but also the lay public. And I'm just wondering, are you optimistic in terms of this, great rush to document these languages? Because over the next 100 years, this is perhaps the most critical time for your science.
I am optimistic because this has great appeal to people once they understand what the challenge is and what the crisis is. Linguistics, for all of the things I appreciated about it, it has become a bit of a esoteric science, and it has gone off on a tangent for the last several decades, in which it was internally focused on itself, on its own models and theories. And there were great debates within linguistics about, theory X or theory Y.
Right.
And outside of linguistics, there was very little traction for these ideas. So if you present people with the simple idea that the world's languages are in crisis, they contain vast bodies of knowledge that we have yet to appreciate, and they are eroding and disappearing very quickly. And with some minimal training, I don't mean to downplay it, you need some very solid training to be able to do documentary linguistics. But with a couple of years of training, you can go out, you can work on a language that very few linguists have worked on before. In some cases, no linguists have worked on before. There are plenty of languages out there that no scientist has studied.
Now, can I ask, are you trying to actually recruit people that would get that kind of training? Is there a need for that?
Absolutely. I am recruiting linguists. And I think the place to recruit them is sort of high school age, because I teach college students, but most students come into college not knowing anything about linguistics at all.
Right.
They think maybe that means you're a polyglot or something, or you speak a lot of languages. They don't understand that it's the science of language. And so, especially with this film, The Linguists, which I've been working on with Ironbound Films, and we've gone to locations around the world. We went to Siberia, we went to India, we went to Bolivia. We visited some of the, what I would call the language hotspots, which are those places around the world where languages are vanishing most rapidly.
Right.
And this is a great recruiting tool because people see sort of the day-to-day life in the field. What is it that the scientist is trying to do? How is the indigenous community reacting to this? And what kind of synergy and collaboration do they have? And I think it's very compelling and people will be interested in it. It does give a kind of sense of discovery. I use that term carefully.
Right.
Because most discoveries that we talk about are not true discoveries. But by discovery, I mean the idea that you become aware yourself of something that you didn't previously know, and that could really change your view of the world.
It's almost a kind of consciousness in a way.
It's definitely consciousness raising to encounter these languages.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for being with us. We'll see you again soon.